Good evening, and welcome to the 2021 Centre for Personalised Medicine annual lecture. I'm Helen King, Principal of St Anne's College, Oxford, and co-chair of the Centre's steering group. The Centre for Personalised Medicine is a partnership between the University of Oxford's Wellcome Centre for Human Genetics and St Anne's College. It's a communication and engagement vehicle for students, academics, clinicians, and the public to explore the benefits and challenges of personalised medicine. To this end, the Centre runs events throughout the academic year, from small college-based lectures, seminars, workshops, and online webinars, through to conference series and public lectures. We're hugely grateful for the financial support the Centre receives from the Dr. Stanley Ho Medical Development Foundation and the Wellcome Trust. Tonight's the first time the annual lecture has been delivered entirely to an online audience, and we're sad that this may limit the usual opportunity for conversation and networking, but at the same time we're delighted that it enables us to reach a larger and more diverse worldwide audience. So welcome and thank you for tuning in. I'm delighted that this evening we're joined by our speaker, Dr. Adam Rutherford, and by Asad Ahmed, who's going to introduce our speaker and chair the question and answer session at the end. Asad is a Royal Television Society award-winning reporter and a BAFTA-nominated presenter for News Programme of the Year. He's reported from around the world and is currently a lead presenter for BBC London Television News. Asad, Adam, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Helen, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for that introduction, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen, from wherever you're joining us this evening for this Centre for Personalised Medicine annual lecture 2021. Obviously, the COVID pandemic means that we sadly can't be in the beautiful city of Oxford tonight. However, this new way of working has created a few upsides as well, it has to be said, and it means that so many people are joining us tonight from various places who haven't been able to come to Oxford for these terrific annual lectures in previous years. So you're all very welcome. You've just had to click a few times on your computer or tap your screen on your phone a few times and hey presto, here we are. The other advantage is that while the lecture is going on this year, you have the choice of drinking some tea or maybe something a bit stronger, and you can watch the whole lecture in your newfound loungewear as well. So some pretty good upsides there. And because there are so many firsts this year with this annual lecture, it's only right that we have a great lecture for you in store. And I think as far as that's concerned, mission has been accomplished because we have a rare scientist who can transfer his scientific skill and knowledge to broadcasting, and he does it tremendously successfully on BBC Radio 4's Inside Science programmes, where he is one of the regular presenters there, and he draws in people through his engaging style. And there are tens of thousands, and we're talking about non-scientists here, who tune in to his programmes. He's a successful author as well of several books. Tonight, he's here to talk to us about race, genomes and data, the bias built into science. It's a particularly interesting topic, especially these days as we live in a world where we're finding some racist ideologies trying to look to science to give them credibility. And we wonder, is there more that science and scientists can do to reject those ideologies? It's one of the areas that we're going to hear more about this evening. And just as well that our speaker has actually written a very engagingly titled book, How to Argue with a Racist, which is an amazing title. Finally, just before we start, normally at these lectures, what we do is have a question and answer session afterwards in the theatre, in the lecture hall. We are still going to do that, but slightly differently this time. If you're joining us on Zoom, what we'd like you to do is click on the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. Type in whatever question you have. You can tell us a bit about yourself as well, so we know who it's coming from. And we'll try and put those questions to Adam afterwards. If you're joining us on YouTube, I know many of you are, very warm welcome to you. You can click on the chat function. Don't be shy, it's nice and easy. We're looking forward to your questions, and it's a lot less intimidating than putting your hand up in a lecture theatre. So now let's welcome to deliver the Centre for Personalised Medicine Annual Lecture 2021, Dr. Adam Rutherford.
Well, thank you, Asad, and thank you to the Centre and everyone who's organised this. It feels like it's been possibly several years in the making, because we were booked in to do it live, I think last year, and then again it was meant to be this year, and so on. But this is what we're doing now, and hopefully soon I can actually come to Oxford and talk about these ideas in front of actual living people. That would be a joy. Thank you to Asad for that kind introduction. I'll be talking about my last book, How to Argue with a Racist, and some of the ideas within that. And also, by coincidence, today we announced my next book, which will be out this time next year, which is also about related themes. It's going to be called Faster, Smarter, Stronger. I may have got that wrong. It's one of those three words in possibly that order, but it's about the history of eugenics, and it's a sort of companion piece to How to Argue with a Racist. Just 2 or 3 points of housekeeping before I get stuck in. Well, the first thing is that it's such an honor to be giving this lecture to the Centre for Personalised Medicine, which is a world-leading genetics institute. However, it is worth mentioning that it's whilst being extremely flattering, I do think it's slightly amusing that next week's lecture, which I believe is next Friday, is by Nobel Prize winning inventor of CRISPR-Cas9, co-inventor, Jennifer Doudna. And I'm giving the annual lecture, and she's just giving some seminar next week. So I utterly urge you to go to that next week, because she's an astonishingly good communicator, as well as being a Nobel Prize winning scientist for the invention of a technology which has fundamentally changed how we do biology in only less than a decade. The second point is, so this is, as I said, this is based on some of the work that I've done in the last book and the next one, which is also subjects that I teach at UCL, where I'm a lecturer. And there are some difficult ideas in here. There is a lot of talk of some of the most pernicious and cruelest acts in our history. And there I will be using some potentially upsetting language in talking about some of these ideas. So that's just a sort of forewarning of the tone of just a couple of ideas that I'll be talking about. And the third thing that I want to mention is that it's the 26th of February today, and then the 24th of February 1871 was the publication of The Descent of Man, so Darwin's second most important book, the 150th anniversary of which we are celebrating this week. Now, all of my work has been based on, in some way, on Darwin. I think the most important thinker of the modern era. And a phrase by another evolutionary biologist called Theodosius Dobzhansky, which is that nothing makes sense in biology except in the light of evolution. And so there isn't a way to talk about genetics and genomics and biology more generally without either directly or inadvertently referencing the work of Darwin. But I'm talking about the history of our field in many ways during the next 40 minutes or so. And so I think I'll start. In fact, let me just share my screen with you, just making sure this works. Hold your horses while I do this. Share screen, and just give me the thumbs up that you can actually see that. I can't see your faces, so it doesn't matter. Okay, there you go. I got a thumbs up. Excellent. So, my first slide is a quote from The Origin of Species, his Darwin's 1859 masterpiece, in which he describes the process of evolution by natural selection. And there's almost no mention of humans in that book. Apart from this sentence, light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history, using typically 19th century language. Now, it was 12 years later in The Descent of Man that he does exactly that. He applies evolutionary theory to us. And that's what makes The Descent of Man such a significant and such an important book in the history of science, and indeed in the history of history. And I think it's complex and flawed, and it features some of the most important ideas that anyone's ever had, and is mired in 19th century language. Darwin was very much a man of his time, even though he was an abolitionist and a liberal. And I think that is the book that we should be reading and should be talking about. he makes more than a cameo appearance in the next few slides. So I'm going to be talking about some of these ideas about how the history of our field, biology more broadly, but I'm a geneticist, which is a field that emerged out of the 19th century sort of milieu of anthropology and broad science, and how that history is structurally associated with the development of scientific racism in the service of empire and the repercussions of that genesis, of that origin, of our own evolution in this field. Much of which is known by historians, some of which is known by scientists, but I think more generally it is important that we know our own history in order that we understand that science has problems that we face and that we need to address. And so I'm going to be throwing out some ideas that I want you to think about, and maybe if you think they're interesting, you can ask us as questions, but they're ideas which are they're deliberately provocative in some sense. And two of them are up here on the screen right now. The first is that data is never neutral because it is curated and designed and harvested by humans. And we may be unaware of how unneutral or how biased it might be. It might be because we've designed experiments or designed data collection poorly, or because there are structural biases built into the way we do science, which have centuries worth of history behind them. The second idea is that science is always political. And I know that when I say things like this in front of other scientists, sometimes they respond negatively and say, well, that's just not true, or at least it shouldn't be. But I think I will demonstrate this, I hope I will argue this point successfully, that while it is a noble aim, that science should be somehow apolitical, it should be somehow that we are seeking a purer truth beyond the baggage of society and politics and our own inbuilt biases. The fact of the matter is that because science is done by people and because it comes with historical baggage in tow, it is always political. And anyone who says otherwise has not really been paying attention for the last 4 centuries at least. And there's a third point, which is that I know that there'll be plenty of geneticists and genomicists in the audience, as well as members of the non-scientific public. And so this is a slightly more precise point aimed more broadly at the scientists, which is that I don't think that we have the language in genetics to accurately describe what it is that we do when we're talking about human variation, when we're talking about human evolution, migration, and all the questions that are fundamental to understanding human variance as measured by the most precise sort of unit of human variance, which is DNA, which is in our genomes. And so that's a question which I think we're trying to address within genetics. And I'm currently involved in writing a paper to try and sort of prompt this conversation, but I think it's something that geneticists need to think about quite hard. This is a quote from my own book, which is a terribly vain thing to do, and I absolutely apologize for doing this, but I think this is the point that exemplifies what I've just said, which is that if you teach or work or use human genetics at all, that is the ocean from which human variation is drawn. And it means that you have little choice but to speak of race and to speak of the history of eugenics, which I won't be talking about tonight, but is a big part of my work. Whether you're unaware of it or not, I think we must make efforts to understand our own history, which is a dark and pernicious history, but the trajectory of that history is one worth celebrating. The roots of our field are intrinsically intertwined with empire and colonialism and slavery and subjugation of people, but the trajectory from the invention of race to today has been one which has demonstrated that race is not a scientifically meaningful concept. So that is fundamentally what I'm going to be talking about, that we're in this era where fundamentally so many things have changed about genetics and about why we're talking about race in this current era. That I highlight here in my lectures are that, well, everyone's aware of the changing political atmosphere, the rise of populism and nationalism around the world. In the UK, we've had Brexit. In the US, they've had Trump. I say that with a slight smirk, because when I have said these things in the past, I couldn't have said had. And since 2001, with the first draft of the human genome sequence, genetics has gone through this ridiculous golden age, an explosion in our techniques, in sequencing, in our understanding of genomes and genes and DNA, and our ability to manipulate it, and so on. This is an astonishing time to be a geneticist and to be interested in genetics. And that's great for me as a science communicator, because there's been a matching popular interest in genetics, which I think is incredibly important and has kept me employed for the last 10 years or so. One thing that I don't think many of us did predict was that part of that popular interest in genetics has come from the commercial genetics market, which I think was relatively unanticipated by the genetics community. So these are primarily ancestry kits from companies like 23andMe or Ancestry.com, but also the commercial genetics market covers a whole load of other areas of DTC genetics, is what we call it, direct to consumer, where you spit in a tube, you send it off to a company, and they process it in some way and tell you something about your DNA in response. Now, I take a pretty dim view of this as a market, but what you cannot deny is that it is absolutely huge. Genetic genealogy, but genealogy itself is the second most popular pastime hobby in the UK. It's the first in the US. It's gardening is the first in the UK. I don't know what that says about us. But there's something like 30 million genomes have been harvested by paying customers to these types of companies, which absolutely dwarfs the amount of genomes that we have available in the public sector, available to geneticists and available to scientists. So it's something we have to take very seriously. Now, when we talk about race, the most obvious thing that people often say and that we teach is that race is a social construct. What that means, it's worth trying to dissect what that actually means, because sometimes it's used rather glibly. Race is just a social construct. What we mean by that is that the way we talk about races is not accurately or usefully, informatively reflected in the metric that we use for measuring human variance and human diversity, which is genetics. And that is not a controversial thing to say within genetics. We've known this for a few decades now, and the era of the genome, we've only ever reinforced this idea. And yet we know what races are. We have a broad sort of social consensus that when we talk about race, we sort of have an agreement that we understand what we're talking about. When people sometimes say that race is just a social construct as a means of sort of undermining the concept of a social construct rather than a biological essentialist view of race, which has been rejected by genetics over the last, I don't know, 20 or 30 years. When they say it's just a social construct, well, that's an absurd tack to take. Because things are social in their origins, because they are to do with or formulated by the interaction between humans, absolutely does not lessen their importance. Two other things that are social constructs are time and money. Those are things that don't have an essential quality to them. They're not real in any meaningful sense. They are social constructs, but if you want to turn up late for a meeting or not pay your electricity bill on the grounds that money and time are merely social constructs, well, good luck with that. It's not going to work out. But sometimes this gets reframed by well-intentioned people who say that race does not exist. Now, this is fundamentally untrue. Race absolutely exists because it is a social construct. The fact that the biological fixity or the idea of biological essentialism does not adhere, does not enforce inform the idea of race, it does not in any way cancel the importance of race actually existing as a social construct. Race does exist because it is a social construct, and that is something that we have to reflect in our work as well. Now, to talk about the history, the invention of race, one must address the primary determinant historically that we have used to categorize people, and that is pigmentation. And as you can see from this very nice picture, pigmentation is highly varied around the world. But we must reflect that it is an invention that pigmentation became the primary determinant of race, and that only began to happen in approximately the 17th century as part of the service of European expansion. That is not to say that pigmentation did not exist before then, or was not referenced in our classical works before the Age of Enlightenment, or the Age of Empires, depending on how you want to frame it. In fact, in the Iliad, our oldest texts in the West, there are specific references to skin colors, to pigmentation. I don't know whether you can hear that, but there's some very loud R&B going out on the street outside. You do not get that in Oxford. In the Iliad, Homer talks about Odysseus. Now my light is falling off the window. This is all absolutely falling apart right at the beginning. We're on slide 4. Hold on. There you go. All right. Yes, Odysseus is described as being swarthy skinned, but this is much more to do with his capricious nature than any sort of essentialist characteristic about him. Homer talks, I can stay like that, my light. Homer talks about Aethiops, meaning the Ethiopians, to describe sub-Saharan Africans more generally. Aethiops literally translates as blackened skin or darkened face. And so there are references to pigmentation, to skin color in our ancient texts. It's just that it's not used as the primary classifier, the primary determinant of a group of people. It is also not to say that bigotry based on human difference did not exist in the past. Of course, it absolutely did. It's just that, for example, in classical Europe, these differences which were fetishized in order to other or subjugate other people were much more to do with culture, language, geography, religion, and pigmentation is just not part of that makeup. Now that is, I'm going to sweep ahead up until the 11th century and just briefly mention the Islamic slave trade era, which lasted for several centuries until the 11th or 12th century, and upwards of 4 or 5 million people enslaved during that era. The great Uzbeki philosopher Avicenna talks about pigmentation with specific reference to the nature of pigmentation of two groups of people, meaning that those people were appropriate for enslavement, were appropriate for subjugation. One of those groups of people is sub-Saharan Africans, but the other group is pale-faced Northern Europeans, who he describes as being feckless and stupid or foolish, and therefore were subject to subjugation, were subject to slavery. And so this is the first solid example that we have of a group of people using pigmentation specifically in order to taxonomize and classify a people with the specific intention of subjugating them. And it is this idea, which happens during the Islamic slave trade era, is a precursor to what becomes the dominant idea behind racial classification that occurred during the Western Enlightenment. So here are some of our key figures in the Enlightenment, all of whom are involved in the invention of race and the invention of science itself. So we've got Carl Linnaeus, top left, that's Voltaire, middle top row, Immanuel Kant, top right, Blumenbach, Johann Blumenbach, a German natural philosopher, Francis Galton, center bottom, and then Chuck D, Charles Darwin, our old pal, bottom right. I'm not going to go through all of these, but these are all key figures in the establishment and the invention of race as we recognize it today. And as I said, this is all part of, in service of European expansion. Let me talk about Linnaeus to start off with, because I think he's terribly important in this. Linnaeus, as every biologist knows, is reasonably recognized as the father of biology. He invents the classification system that we still use today. He's the first major classifier. There were other classifiers before him, but he is the first major classifier of all living organisms. He also included plants and rocks as well as animals in his scheme. The rocks thing didn't work out, but we still do use his system, his binomial system, genus and species, in order to describe biology on Earth today by scientists. We are Homo sapiens. Now, this was all published in Systemae Naturae, so his book that over the course of several decades in the 18th century, he revised and revised and revised. And in the 10th edition, he introduces subspecies of humans that you can see on the page on the right-hand side there, which are Homo sapiens, and then 4 categories based specifically on skin color. The first three of them are on this slide, and bear in mind that this is language of the 18th century, but he describes Homo sapiens americanus as being red-skinned with black straight hair, who are stubborn and zealous and regulated by customs. Asiaticus, so people of East Asia, with yellow skin, straight black hair, greedy, haughty, ruled by opinion. Africanus, black skin, frizzled hair, females without shame, governed by caprice. Now, this is important for a number of reasons. The first is that this is where we have the setup for pigmentation being used, as it is to this day, as the primary determinant of race. The second thing that's important about this is that the first categorization is skin color, red, yellow, and black. And we regard that as pseudoscientific now, as I can talk about in just a minute. But the other criteria that he uses for this taxonomy are value judgments, hugely judgmental judgments about huge populations of people's behaviors. And you can see that they are ridiculous, they are pseudoscientific, they are stereotypes, and they are racist. I don't mean that in a contemporary sense. They are literally hierarchically classifying races. And the reason we can say that with absolute confidence is because the other category is Europeanus, which are white-skinned, blue eyes, gentle, acute, inventive, and governed by laws. Now, this is important because Linnaeus does it here, Kant, Huxley, Blumenbach, and all the many other people of around this time who also try to taxonomize and classify people by races also primarily use skin color, but all of them are not merely classifications. They are hierarchical classifications in which every single example puts white Europeans as superior to any other race. So this is white supremacy in a very literal sense, but it is fundamentally the foundation of how we began to think about classifying humans. And this becomes the dominant theme in racial classification, in human classification, for the next several centuries. The key argument of this time was based around two arguments, really. One was the monogenists and the other was the polygenists. All people at this time regard biblical truth as being the top form of knowledge, and everyone is effectively a creationist. Everyone on earth is derived from Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. The monogenists, though, thought that we evolved different characteristics for humans as we migrated away from Eden, the descendants of Adam and Eve, whereas the polygenists thought that we acquired those characteristics in situ. The extreme polygenists thought that some types of humans were a different species to white Europeans. And so this was the argument of the day in the 18th century, but between those types of gentlemen of science that I showed earlier. It is worth noting that almost none of them traveled. There's no field work involved in this. These are based on secondhand reports from explorers and from sailors and from anthropologists, but mostly these racial classification systems were constructed from their armchairs in their salons in London, in Berlin, and in Paris. Now, of the polygenists, Voltaire, the great hero of the Enlightenment, was perhaps the most rabid. Voltaire believed that sub-Saharan African people were a different species. The following quote is from Voltaire, a hero of the Enlightenment, and someone that deserves his position as one of the founders of Western thought, but it is very important to recognize as well that he was extremely racist, and his view of Black people, sub-Saharan African people, was so extreme that he believed them to be a different species. You can read that quote for yourself. It's important in these discussions to recognize that a key principle in history, by the way, is that we do not judge people from the past by contemporary standards, but it is possible to contextualize their views by comparing their views to their contemporaries. And it is, I think, and historians think, that it is okay to say that Voltaire was a racist and that this view is a reflection of white supremacy, as all the views of most people were at that time. It's a different conversation that we have to have about whether we continue to celebrate these people's works. And I take the view that we should be able to have complex and nuanced views about these people who are very important in the history of Western thought, in the history of science, and also held varying degrees of racist views that fit into their 18th or 19th century worldview in different degrees. And we should be sophisticated enough to recognize both of those things at the same time. I need to talk about Blumenbach very briefly because he's the first person, he's a German natural philosopher, but he's the first person to really introduce metrics into this. So rather than judging people's skin by looking at them and saying these are separate groups of people, Blumenbach was sent 60 skulls from various people from around the world. And with that, he came up with a racial classification scheme based on measuring aspects of these skulls and came to the conclusion that there were 5 races of humans. And it's his introduction of metrics which makes him important in this conversation. Now, there are many examples of this, and I mentioned at the beginning that Darwin and the Descent of Man, which we're now celebrating the 150th anniversary, of which Darwin actually somewhat mocks the idea that there are distinct races or subspecies by pointing out that no one can agree how many there are. He points out that different thinkers have come up with between 1 and 63 different racial categorizations. This quote is from The Descent of Man. And he also goes on to say that he doesn't think, unlike Blumenbach's skulls, that these characteristics are discrete within populations, and actually that they graduate into each other as you move around the world, which is what we now know to be true both morphologically and genetically with 21st century techniques to hand. Darwin also goes on to say that he doesn't imagine that any of these characteristics are fixed in time. So the idea of biological essentialism or biological fixity as being the key idea behind the classifications that his contemporaries and forebears were describing is not true, because humans fit into his scheme of evolution by natural selection. So this is a clear idea of, again, how Darwin was very good at predicting things which subsequently would turn out to be true with 21st century techniques. I'm a big Darwin fanboy, as you can probably tell. He is my intellectual hero in many ways, as he is for many biologists. He is not without his faults, and The Descent of Man is a flawed masterpiece. He definitely includes language and ideas in The Descent of Man which we now find both outmoded and distasteful. He was very liberal for his era. He was an abolitionist. I think it's fair to say that he was probably against racism for the 19th century. I think that is I can defend that opinion quite easily. We sometimes talk about how he was influenced by his taxidermy tutor at Edinburgh, who was a Guyanese former enslaved man called John Edmonston, and that may be true. However, it is also worth pointing out that Darwin doesn't ever mention John Edmonston by name and simply refers to him as a full-blooded Negro in The Descent of Man. So we must be careful not to romanticize even our great heroes, even if they show great modern sensibilities, both politically and scientifically, compared to the modern era as compared to their contemporaries. Let me talk about Huxley briefly. I'm going to get into a story here which is potentially upsetting. Huxley, many of you know, was he was sometimes referred to as Darwin's bulldog, one of his greatest defenders, and a passionate supporter of the idea of evolution by natural selection. Huxley has a go at human classification in 1870. It comes up with around 10 or 11 different races of humans, employing some words which I think all of us are very grateful never really caught on: xanthochroi and melanochroi, but again, reference to skin color, even in the now the late 19th century. But one thing that I think is the reason I bring Huxley up specifically is because his introduction of multiple groups of people within Africa, so the melanochroi, slightly more pale-skinned people in North Africa, Negro, generic sub-Saharan Africans, and Bushmen, who we might refer to as Khoi or Khoisan today. And he separates those into 3 groups. I'll talk briefly about the ludicrousness of trying to classify the continent of Africa in just a minute. But I'm not pinning this exactly on Huxley, but the introduction of new skin colors or a variation in skin colors that have been introduced into the African continent forms the basis of one of the most pernicious acts in the 20th century. And this is one of the reasons why we should be talking about this right now. What I'm talking about is the conflict in Rwanda. And the reason I'm talking about this is because the Hutu and the Tutsi, who we all know in the 90s were the main parties in this great civil war, this terrible, terrible civil war, and had been in conflict with each other for much of the second half of the 20th century. The roots of that conflict are very, very firmly with invented pseudoscience of imperialists, of first German and subsequently Belgian colonists, who invented classification systems and metrics onto the Tutsi and the Rwanda in order to maintain better relations with one group over the other, the Tutsi rather than the Hutu. And they did this via the fact that Tutsis on average have slightly lighter pigmented skin and have a much higher degree of pastoralism in their populations, which means that they can continue to process milk into adulthood, which is something that Europeans do, but most people throughout history and most people on Earth today can't do via a mutation which we refer to as lactose persistence. Now, Huxley didn't do this, but the Belgian and German colonizers of the late 19th and early 20th century asserted that the reason that the Tutsi had paler skin and were pastoralists and could drink milk as a result of this, and also had slightly larger cranial capacity, was because they had European ancestry or Eurasian ancestry via a group of people referred to as the Hamites, which is an invented group of people from the 19th century, invented in the 19th century, but the sons of Ham, right, with blackened skin, which is a reference from the Talmud or the Torah, one of the two, and I forget which, someone will correct me. But the curse of Ham is the blackened skin, and that Eurasian introgression of Eurasian characteristics into the Tutsi rather than the Hutu made them superior, and therefore they maintained better relationships. The Germans and the Belgians maintained better relationships with the Tutsi than the Hutu, which was purely for commercial gain. Now, the tragedy of this is that the Hutu and the Tutsi bought into this myth and introduced in 1931, what you can see there, which are identity cards which have ethnicities specified on them. And then by the time the Belgian colonists leave in 1959 and install a Tutsi government, we already have the template for a conflict which will accelerate until well into the 1990s, culminating in 1994 with a genocide where 100,000 people are killed in the space of 100 days. 1994, that was. I was an undergraduate in the Galton laboratory at that time. This is within our lifetimes, and I presume many of you will remember this. So this is an example of how the pseudoscience of empire, of colonists, has direct repercussions into the present era, and we need to be aware of that history in order to recognize the roots of the fundamental racism that we see around the Earth today. Now, how am I doing for time? Okay, so we are an African species. This is something that we say in evolutionary biology, evolutionary anthropology a lot, and it is true. What we mean by that is that Homo sapiens originated on the African continent, which means that most of our evolution occurred on Africa. And we, until a few years ago, thought that Homo sapiens emerged in the east of Africa, mostly because specimens were found, the oldest specimens were found in Ethiopia and along the Rift Valley. We now think that the oldest Homo sapiens were found in Morocco about 300 to 315,000 years ago. And I think we're beginning to think that Homo sapiens is a sort of Gestalt African species, but we still mean very precisely and very accurately that Homo sapiens is an African species. And I don't like these types of maps particularly. I sometimes have referred to them as Dad's Army maps, as they show migrations over periods of times which are inconceivable to us. When we talk about migration in anthropological terms or paleoanthropological terms, it's not in any way recognizable by contemporary use of the word migration. The rate at which a very small proportion of the total population of Homo sapiens left Africa, something like 70 or 80,000 years ago, was a few miles per year at best, right? They're falling away on average from Africa. So migration isn't really a useful word in the modern context. And I often come across, when I talk to publics, I often come across a confusion, a very, very understandable confusion about what we're talking about when we say the out of Africa event, which probably took 10,000 years to unfold. But what we see from this map is that we started in Africa, the majority of people stayed in Africa, a small proportion of people left Africa and began the process of populating the whole of the rest of the world. I prefer this diagram from a figure from a paper by my colleague at UCL, Mark Thomas, which shows genetic diversity. It has a different purpose, but for my purposes, it shows genetic diversity on land masses scaled by diversity. And you can see quite clearly that the most diversity in the genome occurs in Africa, as absolutely befits our understanding of human evolution and the notion that Homo sapiens is an African species. Now, when it comes to pigmentation, we now know very clearly that there is more variation in pigmentation within Africa than the rest of the world. We know that, as would serve that first point, there is more diversity in pigmentation genes than in the rest of the world. We also know that alleles associated with light and dark pigmentation predate Homo sapiens by hundreds of thousands of years. So we were varied in our skin tones before we were our species, and certainly a long time before we left Africa. We know this now because these studies have begun to be done within Africa. And the astonishing thing about that sentence that I just said is that that has only really occurred in the last 5 or 10 years maximum. And so this deep irony that the primary determinant of racial classification, which begins with Linnaeus in the 18th century and becomes the primary determinant for racial classification for the next several centuries, including as the social construct that we continue to use today, we didn't actually look at the basis of that using modern techniques in genetics and genomics until the 2000s, until the 2010s, really. And that is a very clear example of how skewed our data sets are in genomics and in anthropology and in paleoanthropology, that we just haven't looked very hard at places like Africa. We know that our data sets are enormously skewed towards European ancestry for understandable reasons. Most genetics is done in Western Europe and America, but also to recognize that there is structural bias in there as well, that we are only now beginning to be aware of. As a sort of summary of the last few ideas that I've been talking about. So when we say race is a social construct, we have to recognize that something which is non-controversial to say now, that pigmentation is a terrible proxy for overall genetic relatedness, and that our data sets are hugely skewed towards European ancestry. And I know that the people from the Center for Personalised Genomics absolutely know that, but part of, a little bit like being an alcoholic, the first step is to admit we have a problem whilst we begin to work out how to fix that problem, which I think is happening in genetics, but I think needs to be nurtured as a conversation, prioritized in action. The idea of us being of race being a construct, it is constructed from these historical and political and economic contexts, and racial groups don't correspond usefully to inherited biological variations. Now, I mentioned at the beginning the third idea. So the first two, that science is always political, data is always never neutral and often biased. And the third one was the language of what we do. And we have a number of problems in genetics when talking about human variation and talking about genetics, because we use a language which is imprecise, or more specifically, There are certain words we use which are scientifically meaningless. There are certain words we use which are very specific to population genetics, but not to anthropology, for example, such as ethnicity. And there are certain words that we use which are confusing to geneticists, anthropologists, and have a different meaning in vernacular. So they have a different meaning to people out on the street. And this is a fundamental hindrance to two aspects of what it is that we do. One is it doesn't serve science, and that is very important. And secondly, it doesn't serve ideas like diversity and increasing diversity within science. And this is a fundamental problem. We still see the use of words like race and Caucasian within the academic literature. And when I was thinking about this the other day, because I mentioned that we're writing a paper trying to understand how, or we're trying to begin the process of fixing this, I just figured that race and Caucasian were words that get accidentally used or used by perhaps researchers where English isn't the first language, or they aren't as aware of these conversations. Someone pointed out that an interesting paper by some Japanese authors used the word Caucasian throughout it. And I looked at it and thought, man, that's madness. Why would you still use the word Caucasian? So I looked on PubMed and found that the use of the words Caucasian and race in academic literature are modern phenomena. They peak in the mid-2010s. And they're beginning to trail off now, but this is not some hangover from the 19th century. The word Caucasian itself was coined by Blumenbach in order to describe white people as being more beautiful than black people. So we've got a fundamental problem here. We know that race is not an informative word scientifically, biologically, or scientifically in that regard. We know that Caucasian is a word invented to serve racial superiority of white people and is virtually meaningless in terms of human genetics. Maybe a geneticist in the questions will tell me that's wrong. But those two words, neither of which serve science, also come laden with baggage of our race science history. And they just need to not be used at all. However, at the same time, I don't have a proposal for the best way to describe human variation in ways that serves the science, and also at the same time doesn't alienate groups of people or reinforce stereotypes or racialized views from our past. But it's worth recognizing that this is a current problem. This is not a historical artifact. This is what we're doing today in genetics and in other life sciences. I should probably wrap up pretty quickly. It's worth mentioning COVID because it's a good example of how we lean towards the science when it comes to ideas about race very quickly. I expect many of you know that the proportion of, in the UK, Black and Asian people who were infected or died from COVID, and in the States that includes Latino and Hispanic people, was very, very much disproportionately higher than it was for European descended people. And COVID became racialized very quickly via two routes. One was the provenance of the disease. There is a whole webpage dedicated to the thousands of racialized attacks in America. And a kid from my own university, who's Singaporean, was beaten up in Oxford Street in February. The second way that COVID was racialized is in recognition that more minority groups were affected and more heavily affected, and in a disproportionate way. Immediately, as soon as we began to see those data emerging, the public conversation is, what's different about these people? It becomes molecularly biologized almost instantaneously. People start looking for variants in the genome, which do exist and may indeed increase the likelihood or the susceptibility to COVID and other diseases. But also an obsession with vitamin D metabolism, which has some antiviral properties, admittedly. But the fact of the matter is that this disparity is entirely unsurprising, because medicine is racialized already via socioeconomic means. Right? There may well be biological reasons why some groups of people or some ancestries are more predisposed to COVID infection and death than others. But the fact of the matter is that people in these groups are more likely to be key workers, so therefore not locking down, more likely to be in multi-generational households, in urban centers, in dense housing, and for a whole bunch of reasons are much more likely to be infected and indeed to die. And the reason we know this, and the reason we can say this with absolute confidence, is because it's not unique to COVID. That's how all infectious diseases, and all doctors will tell you the same thing. There's much better correlation between the disparity in infection for COVID with socioeconomic status than with some biological essentialism, which, you know, maybe there is something to do with vitamin D metabolism, which accounts for what I would guess will be a very small proportion of that disparity. Now, I've got a quick, I know I'm running out of time, and I warned them I was bad at timekeeping and I would like some questions. Let me just quickly talk about one of the most controversial and most racialized and racist ideas in the history of science. I am not an IQ denialist at all. IQ is an important metric because it's been studied for more than a century, and it measures something important about cognitive abilities. I think when people say IQ only measures how good you are at IQ test, well, that is literally true, but it's also literally true for the driving test or the 100 meters sprint. So it's not a very sensible thing to say. Is it culturally specific? Absolutely. It's so culturally specific, but psychologists are aware of this, and good research goes into fixing or recognizing that as a confounding factor. This is a map which purports to show national IQs, standardized national IQs from around the world for 185-ish countries. And this is a weapon of the racist right, of racist pseudoscience. You will see, if you spend any time, as I do, in racist websites or on Twitter, which is a racist website, then this map gets thrown around all the time. And what you see is that most countries in sub-Saharan Africa appear to be at least one standard deviation, in some cases, 2 standard deviations away from an average IQ of 100. And you think, well, that is shocking, apart from the fact that it means, according to the DSM-4 categorization for cognitive abilities, whole countries should be incapable of day-to-day care of themselves, according to these data. So that is extremely troubling and almost certainly untrue. But then looking at the provenance of these data, as projects are beginning to do, and I've been aware of for a few years, but it's coming into the public light more and more, this is a data set which is used, we think, in hundreds, if not maybe up to 1,000 papers and many policy documents. And we look at some of the numbers which come out, with shocking statistics here, that Botswana has an average national IQ of 69.5, that Nepal has an average IQ of 43, right? I mean, that's absolutely shocking. Until you see that these were compiled primarily by an actual racist scientist called Richard Lynn and various colleagues over the years, and you look at the provenance of the data set, which I show you here, that the average IQ of Botswana was based on 104 students tested in English, with English not as their first language, that the Namibian one was a single sample of 100 Herero-speaking children, that the Nepalese one was a study of vitamin A deficiency in farmers in rural Nepal, tested not in their first language, and so on. And in fact, 70 or 80, I forget the exact number, of the countries that are on that map, they didn't have a national IQ for, and they calculated it by averaging the 2 neighboring countries. Now, this data set is used, as I said, in hundreds, maybe up to 1,000 papers. We're in the process of working that out. And yet it is referred to as if it was some set of data that was true, that was just, had been harvested honestly and not by actual white supremacist racists. And so it's an extreme example of how our data is skewed, and yet we continue to use it. So it's really important that we're aware of the provenance of our data sets. So we can get to questions, I will finish. And I want to finish with this Darwin quote, because, it all got rather serious towards the end there. It is a serious topic. But we're recognizing The Descent of Man's 150th and Darwin's birthday, which was a couple of weeks ago, and his role in this, a complex, flawed character and book. But I think there is a sentiment in The Descent of Man which is worth celebrating, which is there, that while you read it for yourself, you can read it in your own Darwin voice, that we should extend our sympathies to all members of the same nation and beyond, though they are personally unknown to us. And that point once being reached, there is only an artificial barrier to prevent our sympathies extending to the people of all nations and all races. And that's why we should all read The Descent of Man. And I thank you for your time, and I wish I could hear the inevitable applause.
It is an inevitable applause. I can assure you people are clapping wherever they're watching this. Dr. Adam Rutherford, thank you for that fascinating lecture there. Now, I've got a number of questions which have been coming in while you've been speaking. So I'm just going to run through as many of them as possible as I can. I'm going to ask for people's apology already, for forgiveness already, for I know I won't be able to probably get through all of them in the few minutes that's remaining. So straight on with it, Dr. Rutherford. Here's one question. Do you think there's a taboo around mention of race which discourages genuine constructive discussion?
Yeah, excuse me, I'm just pouring a glass of wine. Well, it's a frequently heard mantra, that, and I think honestly the answer is no. And I account for this in the book, in fact, that if one looks at the history of scientific papers in the 20th and 21st century that use race or that talk about race, there are literally hundreds and thousands of them, some very much more serious than others. The ones that are to do with ethnicities in relation to genomics and personalized medicine, which are incredibly important, there will be people in the audience listening right now who have literally published dozens of papers with reference to that. When it comes to IQ, what I was talking about at the end, you get the same accusation. You can't talk about IQ and race at all, except if you actually look for the number of papers and the number of public, articles or reviews or features that talk about race and IQ. There are innumerable numbers, uncountable numbers. So it's one of those sort of self-reinforcing, you are heretical if you talk about this. Well, absolutely, that is completely demonstrably untrue. And in fact, an academic paper published just last year accounted for that exact phenomenon. It did a very forensic analysis of every accusation of, you can't talk about this, or people being cancelled for talking about this. And in every single case, it was a confection. It was simply not true. So I think it's a valid question. I think when you look at the data, the answer is no.
Okay, thanks for that, Dr. Rutherford. Straight on with the next question, because there are so many coming through. What can we do to combat people using past sciencey racist theories as examples to justify their opinion of racial supremacy? For example, this questioner asks issues such as supposed IQ science, which you mentioned at the end of your lecture.
Yeah, I don't know. I've been doing this for a while, and the answer is I don't know. I think I believe that better arguments win. It depends who's talking. I think that in the book and in a lot of my work, into the public-facing work, we get distracted by conversations with white supremacists and neo-Nazis. They do deserve to be confronted, but I am fundamentally more concerned with people who are not racists and don't, who are, but who express inadvertently what are effectively racist views because of the societal stereotypes and the structural racisms that exist within our society. And I think those are the people who are much more susceptible to persuasion via argument. A lot of people, when I was writing the book, young people in particular, were saying, I wish I had this to hand at Christmas, right? When I'm at home with my parents, when, your uncle says something a little bit racist and you think, was that a little bit racist? But I'm not quite sure why. I don't quite have the tools to answer it. So yeah, I mean, I believe better arguments are the way forward there.
Okay. Adam, next one. I'm a statistician, and I agree with Adam completely that data is never neutral. Could Adam talk about the conflict we experience? We risk perpetuating the racist classifications in our data, but on the other hand, we need data to demonstrate disadvantage and prejudice. And the examples given of the statistics on the disproportionate stop and search of Black men.
Well, we need good statistics, and only in Oxford do you get people saying, "I'm starting a question with I'm a statistician, and here's a very sensible question." That's not true. You get that in many places, but I appreciate that. I think the answer to that question is that in early education, we fail our society by not teaching the fundamentals of risk, of probability, and statistical analysis. And so statistics becomes a lazy tool for people to use ideologically as a crutch to support their arguments. When in fact, statistics is a science, and an art in many ways. I'm absolutely terrible at it, but I think fundamentally we don't teach risk, and we don't teach probability, and we don't teach the probabilistic nature of, for example, genomics and genetics at school. And I think these things have to be the bedrock of understanding the complexities, if for no other reason that we've seen in the last year, which is that the presentation of statistics in the public eye, which has been, I think, unprecedented in 2020 in our history, is vulnerable to misinterpretation. How we present, when we saw Boris Johnson standing up in number 10 with some of those graphs, and I remember there was a point where me and my friend and colleague Hannah Fry and other mathematicians and friends were looking at these graphs and just going, what the is that? This is not good science communication. I'm sure there's some important data in there, but I don't understand that, and I should be able to. And my mathematician colleague is looking at that and just going, that is a nonsense. So I think the answer to your question, Mr. or Mrs. Statistician, is we need to be better at statistics, and you do that at school.
Okay, Adam, next one. We are quickly running out of time, but I want to try and get another couple in if I can. This one's about terminology. Whenever I hear pseudoscience, this person asks, it sounds like avoiding acknowledging that it was just science at the time. Wouldn't it be better to call it settler or colonial science?
Well, yes. I mean, if I didn't say that during that talk, I normally nuance what was by saying what was regarded as science, but what we would now regard as pseudoscience. So it's a very valid point. Settler science, that is an interesting way of phrasing it. I do describe in A Brief History of Everyone Who Ever Lived the contemporary behavior of some geneticists as being soft colonial science, because I think it is very reminiscent of that behavior. But again, your question, Mel, because now I'm looking at the questions, is precisely my point. We don't really have very good, we don't have language to describe what it is that we do.
Okay, Adam, one last question here, and apologies for all the questions I've not been able to ask, but this has just come in. How should we address it when papers use racist theories like phrenology as the base to their algorithms?
Well, if they get published, then there's a failure of peer review, but then there's a broad, there's a much broader problem that if the reviewers are failing to recognize that there is nonsense like phrenology, or the return of phrenological ideas, or craniotomy or craniometrics being used in ways which are fundamentally flawed, then that is a failure of peer review. I think generally peer review works pretty well, but it is. I think Churchill described democracy as being the least worst, the least good system of governance, unless you consider all the rest. And I think that peer review in science is redolent of that as well. But there's a much deeper question there, which is I believe, having worked at Nature for 10 years and having been a science communicator for 10 years, I believe that the science publishing ecosystem is fundamentally broken, and the way to fix it is to burn it all down to the ground and start again. I don't know what the correct way of doing this, and there'll be some scientists listening going, oh my God, I'm clutching their pearls there, but it is fundamentally broken. And in that regard, I'm a pretty sort of socially conservative person generally, or middle of the road, but in that regard, I'm an absolute revolutionary. I think it should be burnt to the ground. I can see, just very briefly, Lauren Vedikind has got a question about this book, which I thoroughly recommend. She just asked it, and it was just on my shelf, so I thought I'd acknowledge that. But listen, Thank you all. Thanks, Asad.
Dr. Adam Rutherford, thank you so much. This is a point where you'll just have to imagine the applause taking place with the many hundreds of people who are joining us on YouTube and on Zoom this evening. Many thanks for that. Let me just at this point say that the Centre for Personalised Medicine will be exploring some of the ideas you've heard about this evening in a conference called Facing Up to Disparities in Healthcare. It's taking place on the 7th and 8th of June. You can get the details for it on the CPM website. The address for that is cpm.well.ox.ac.uk. Thank you to the Centre for Personalised Medicine for organising tonight's fantastic annual lecture, a really memorable one for 2021. Thank you, of course, to Dr. Adam Rutherford for his fascinating lecture. And you can tell people about what you've just heard. The lecture will be available on the CPM website. It will probably be available on YouTube as well. So if you want to watch and listen again, or you want to tell others about how good it was, they can find out for themselves by logging on. Most importantly, thank you to everybody who's joined us this evening from wherever you've been, to the many, many people who've joined us for the first time. We hope this won't be the last time you join us for the CPM annual lecture.